The Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Protection, and Innovation will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on preparing for the future and assessment of emerging cyber threats.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that our colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Joyce, be able to fully participate in today's hearing.
Hearing no objections, so ordered. Good afternoon. I want to welcome the witnesses to today's hearing on how we seek to balance the benefits of technical innovation with the security vulnerabilities that it may bring. The rapid proliferation of new technology is changing the world. Advancements in artificial intelligence, AI, and quantum computing will equip us with new tools to defend ourselves and break down barriers to new research that could improve the way we live and save lives. Unfortunately, one man's tool is another man's weapon. Sophisticated nation-state actors like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea have already weaponized new technologies to disrupt our democracy, compromise our national security, and undermine our economy. As technology improves, so will their ability to use it against us. I am particularly concerned about the impact of new technologies on our elections. In the lead up to the 2016 presidential election, Russia mounted an unprecedented influence and disinformation campaign that used bots to automatically tweet divisive messages from fake accounts. As we move into the heart of the 2020 election cycle, we must be prepared for our adversaries to use AI-generated deepfakes to create a false history, sow discord, and inject skepticism into our national elections. To start, online platforms must learn to identify deepfakes and publish policies about how they will handle them. At the same time, we need to educate the public to ensure that they are informed consumers of information. More broadly, ensuring that emerging technologies are developed and deployed responsibly requires U.S. leadership, and I am concerned that we are not demonstrating that now. For years, the federal government has cut research and development dollars to meet budget caps, and I am worried that countries like China are outpacing our investment. Our failure to put money into R&D may cost us not only our strategic advantage as the world's leader in technology, but the global influence that stems from it. What is most alarming, however, is the lack of attention that this administration is giving to this important national security issue. Despite the fact that our intelligence agencies have confirmed that nation-state actors are utilizing the emerging technology for their strategic advantage, the administration annually slashes R&D funding under the false promise that the private sector will make up the difference. Maintaining U.S. leadership in this space will require direction, coordination, and money from the federal government. Before I close, I want to address a final issue that is causing concern in my district and others like it: how AI and automation will affect the workforce. Automation has already decreased the availability of jobs in the labor market, and I worry about the national and economic security consequences that could result if we do not adequately plan for this transition. I look forward to our witnesses' thoughts on this important issue today. The success of our nation and economic security rests on whether the federal government can effectively partner with its allies, state and local partners, and the private sector to develop policies that both incentivize investment in emerging technology and manage the risk associated with it when it falls into the hands of our adversaries. I look forward to understanding how this committee can assist in the development of safe, secure, and responsible technologies. I will now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having me here today, and thank you for the witnesses. I appreciate you coming today. During my time as a federal prosecutor over 2 decades, I saw firsthand how criminals evolved and adapted to changes. As I've learned about the cyber landscape as ranking member of this subcommittee, I've been amazed at the number and diversity of the cyber threats we face today. These threats are always evolving and adapting to new obstacles, new protections, new tactics, and new technologies. All levels of government, federal, state, and local, as well as our allies around the globe, the private sector, academia, and nonprofits must work together in order to protect against emerging cyber threats. Today's technologies have a number of vulnerabilities that must be protected from bad actors. In the first 6 months of this year, more than 4 million records have been exposed due to data breaches. Ransomware attacks have doubled in 2019 in my district, Syracuse School District, for example, and the Onondaga County Library System both suffered ransomware attacks from unknown threat actors in the last month. More citizens than ever are falling victim to phishing attacks and malware. Cybercrime made up 61% of the attacks that cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike saw between January and June of this year. And these are just the attacks and statistics that we're aware of. Many experts believe incidents to be vastly underreported. These threats are persistent, complex, and on the rise, and cybersecurity must constantly evolve in order to provide protection. As evidenced by the number of incidents in this year alone, this is a difficult endeavor that it cannot be done without help. As I heard from my constituents in my district, companies and local government entities need assistance and guidance to identify, protect against, and recover from certain current cyber threats. And these are just the threats we see with our current technology. Our cyber landscape is becoming increasingly sophisticated, and new innovations are being introduced every day. These advances have put cybersecurity out of reach for even more small, medium, and large businesses, as well as state and local governments who simply cannot afford it. It is estimated that 22 million Internet of Things devices will be online by 2025. 5G deployment is just around the corner. Artificial intelligence and machine learning, while making impacts today, are projected to have even more of an enormous effect on our lives in the years ahead. Quantum computing, which is a huge concern, is on the horizon. These emerging technologies will undoubtedly present new and evolving cyber threats. While we are staying vigilant and working to protect against current hazards, we must also be preparing for our future ones. Our first step is to better understand these new threats, and this hearing is a very good start. I'm also working to educate my colleagues on the challenges and opportunities of the Internet of Things, and the co-chair of the Internet of Things Caucus, and have spent time learning from Syracuse University about the quantum research they are working on in partnership with the Air Force Research Lab. And I will do more to seek out opportunities to improve our cybersecurity against current and emerging threats. I want to thank the chairman for holding this important hearing today, and to our witnesses here to help us understand the emerging threat landscape. In closing, I'd like to note that I view the cyber advancements much differently than I view other products that are come out of the market. A lot of products, like in the automobile arena, they consider the safety aspects along with the emerging technology in the cars. They don't always do that with cyber technology, and we're constantly playing catch up. That's why it's really important that the chairman and myself and others on this committee work diligently to get the information we need to try and catch up to the advancements in technology, which always seem a couple of steps ahead. So with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now recognize the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Chairman Richmond for holding today's hearing on emerging cyber threats. I've served on the Homeland Security Committee since its inception. Over that period of time, I've watched the tactics our adversaries use against us evolve and the threat landscape grow. As new network devices and information technologies enter the marketplace, many become so mesmerized by their potential for good that we fail to appreciate and plan for the security consequences. Although I'm encouraged that we are having more conversations about the nexus between technology and security today, there's still much to be done. So I commend Chairman Richmond for holding today's hearing. When this committee was established a decade and a half ago, we focused our efforts on defending against physical attacks committed by terrorists who would readily claim responsibility. Now we are faced with cyber threats from state and non-state actors who use cyber tools to carry out attacks in secret, blur attribution, and complicate our ability to impose consequences. As technology continues to evolve, so too will the tools of our adversaries. Last December, DHS, DOD, the State Department, and the Office of Director of National Intelligence identified Internet of Things devices, artificial intelligence, and quantum technology as emerging dual-use technologies that pose a threat to our national security. A month later, then Director of National Intelligence Dan Coates warned that our adversaries and strategic competitors will increasingly use cyber capabilities, including cyber espionage, attacks, and influence, to seek political, economic, and military advantage over the United States and its allies and partners. Unfortunately, much of what DNI warned us about is in fact already happening. We know that Russia has relied on the cyber capabilities to carry out influence campaigns designed to divide Americans and swing elections. In efforts to manipulate Americans on social media platforms are widespread, but technologically simple. I worry about the influence campaign of the future where Russia uses AI to create deep fakes that make it nearly impossible to discern fact from fiction. We know that China has engaged in intelligence gathering and economic espionage and has successfully breached OPM, Navy contractors, and non-governmental entities from hotels to research institutions. We also know that China is investing heavily in developing quantum computing capabilities, which could undermine the security value of encryption within the next decade. Over the past year, the Department of Justice has indicted 2 Iranians for their role in the ransomware attack against the city of Atlanta, and Microsoft recently revealed that Iran had attempted to breach a presidential campaign. And according to the UN Security Council, North Korea has used its cyber capabilities to evade sanctions, stealing $670 million in various foreign and cryptocurrencies between 2015 and 2018. The momentum Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea have demonstrated related to their use of cyber tools shows no sign of slowing. We must prepare ourselves to harness the security, economic, and healthcare benefits of emerging technologies like AI and quantum computing will yield while defending ourselves against adversaries who would use technology against us. But the government cannot do it alone. The private sector is a critical partner in this effort. I'm eager to hear from our witnesses how the federal government can ensure the responsible deployment of emerging technologies. With that, I thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to the testimony and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome our panel of witnesses. First, I am pleased to welcome Mr. Ken Durbin, Senior Strategist for Global Government Affairs at Symantec, where he has provided solutions to the public sector for over 30 years. Next, we have Mr. Robert Kaneki, who is a Senior Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations and a Senior Research Scientist at Northwestern University's Global Resilience Institute. Mr. Kaneki served as Director for Cybersecurity Policy at the National Security Council from 2011 to 2015. Next, Ms. Niloufer, is that right? Razi, which is the easy part, Howe, is a fellow at New America's Cybersecurity Initiative. Ms. Howe has been an investor, executive, and entrepreneur in the technology industry for the past 25 years, with a focus on cybersecurity for the past 10. Most recently, Ms. Howe served as Chief Strategy Officer and Senior Vice President of Strategy and Operations at RSA, a global cybersecurity company. Finally, Dr. Ben Buchanan is a Senior Faculty Fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. He has written journal articles and peer-reviewed papers on artificial intelligence, attributing cyber attacks, deterrence in cyber operations, cryptography, election cybersecurity, and the spread of malicious code between nations and non-state actors. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted into the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Durbin.
Chairman Richmond, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Katko. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. Assessing emerging threats is important, but we can't forget about traditional threats that have been repurposed. I'll address both in my testimony. I'll start with a couple key findings from our 2019 Internet Security Threat Report. Email has been a traditional threat vector cyber criminals constantly repurpose. The latest exploit is the use of Microsoft Office attachments to deliver malicious payloads. 48% of malicious email attachments were, in fact, Microsoft Office documents. Attacks on endpoints from the web continue to grow. We saw a 56% increase in web attacks in 2018. By the end of 2018, Symantec blocked more than 1.3 million unique web attacks on endpoints every day. As this committee well knows, supply chain attacks remain a persistent and serious threat. There was a 78% increase in supply chain attacks, which exploit third-party services and software to compromise a target. Deepfakes, on the other hand, are an emerging threat. Deepfake are audios or videos created by artificial intelligence systems and used to make the public believe they are authentic. Deepfakes are new and not typically viewed as a threat to enterprise security. Fake videos, photos, or audio recordings represent a serious risk to the enterprise, since to create convincing deepfakes, you simply need the internet, a gaming PC, and the right software. A deepfake of a CEO announcing a layoff or used to order an employee to transfer funds or intellectual property could hurt their reputation and their stock price. Until we can identify or block deepfakes, organizations will be best served implementing rapid response plans that can be executed as soon as a deepfake is identified. Twitter bots have emerged as a threat hiding in plain sight. Symantec analyzed content released by Twitter, originally posted on their service by the Russian-based Internet Research Agency. The IRA content was used as part of a Twitter bot campaign directed against the 2016 US elections. The operation was carefully planned, with accounts often registered months before they were used. The dataset consisted of 3,836 Twitter accounts and nearly 10 million tweets. They attracted almost 6.4 million followers, and they, in turn, followed 3.2 million accounts. A core group of 123 main accounts was used to push out new content, while a larger pool of auxiliary accounts amplify messages pushed out by the main accounts. One main account only tweeted 10,794 times, but was retweeted over 6 million times. Targeted ransomware has been repurposed to focus on the enterprise. During 2018, attacks against organizations rose by 12%, but represented 81% of all infections that year. State and local governments were hit hard. The city of Atlanta was attacked and chose not to pay the ransom. Cleanup is expected to exceed $10 million. The Colorado Department of Transportation spent $1.5 million to clean up after their attack. 2 Florida cities took another direction and paid the ransom, which totaled $1 million between them. Targeted attacks have tools to infect a large number of computers simultaneously, maximizing the number of assets to improve the chances the victim will pay the ransom. Mobile is an example of a kind of self-inflicted threat. Mobile devices are susceptible to unwanted cyber threats and threats we allow via app permissions. We looked at apps on both the Google and Android platforms and found both requested personal information and access to similar device functions. Many of these requests were reasonable, but many were excessive and questionable. We looked at a flashlight app, which has over 10 million installs, that wanted access to the user's location, contacts, and permission to make calls. It's difficult to imagine why a flashlight app needs your contacts, call your friends, or know your exact location. Users are opening themselves up to potential threats since they grant permission without understanding what the app developer will do with that data. Finally, stalkerware is a type of malware that is secretly loaded on an unsuspecting victim computing device, giving almost total control of the device to an ex-spouse, ex-boyfriend, or other stalker, who would then know the victim's exact location, be able to read their emails and texts, and even turn on their microphone or camera. So why is stalkerware commercially available? Publishers of stalkerware typically advertise their product as parental monitoring software to keep kids safe. And this can certainly be true when it is used appropriately by a responsible parent. However, the features built into some of these apps give more control than parents would need, which make them ripe for abuse. In closing, emerging threats that try to influence beliefs or drive behavior need to be assessed along with the repurposed traditional threats. The focus of this committee is vital for our nation to understand these threats and ensure resources are allocated to defend against them. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I would be happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Durbin. Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Kaneki to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to break down my remarks into 3 categories. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to break down my comments into 3 categories, what I'll call the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that I think we're actually making progress in cybersecurity. 10 years ago, when I wrote my first book on cyber warfare, it was a dire prognosis for the patient. We concluded in that the attacker had an overwhelming advantage and that private companies could not possibly protect themselves from Russian, Chinese, or other state-based adversaries. I think the last 10 years have showed us that, in fact, some companies are able to manage the risk from even the most sophisticated adversaries, and they're able to do it day in and day out. In the last decade, we've seen the development not just of new technology, but new doctrine and new strategies and new tactics for defense. Most notably, I'll call out the kill chain, right? This is the basic concept that an adversary doesn't simply need to compromise a single host. They need to go through a series anywhere from 7 to 22 steps, depending on how you count, to achieve their objective. And so from that perspective, a defender only needs to detect them at one and block them at one of those stages. This kind of thinking has allowed us to reverse the notion that the offense has an overwhelming advantage in this space. And we now have tooling around that. Technology like endpoint detection and response, endpoint protection program that can automatically identify malware. These technologies have really helped us turn a quarter for the most sophisticated of cyber defense programs. That's the good news. What we need to do now, of course, is create the incentives and the structures and the government enablement to drive these innovations down into the wider markets so that school districts and local governments and mom and pop businesses are able to achieve this level of cybersecurity. The bad news is, of course, the technology landscape, as you all know, is rapidly changing. This may mean that by the time we get in place these secure systems, these secure concepts that will help protect the state of play today, the technical terrain is going to have changed. We've talked about IoT, we've talked about AI, and we've talked about quantum. Those, I think, are the 3 big changes out there. I would add with IoT, 5G, ubiquitous high-speed connectivity is gonna enable so many millions of devices to be connected. What we've seen so far is that for IoT, it's not really so much a new technology as a trend towards cheaper computers and ubiquitous connectivity that's enabling us to put computers everywhere. What we're not doing is learning the lessons from the past 20 years of enterprise security and applying those lessons into the IoT space. For artificial intelligence and quantum, the only thing I can say is we've got to make sure that this is a race between the United States of America and the Chinese, not a race between Silicon Valley and the Chinese. The capability that Silicon Valley is bringing to this fight is immensely important, but they're acting in their commercial interests as they should as private businesses. We need to ensure that we have the funding there. So finally, I would say the ugly of it is government intervention in this space. We've got to make sure that government is helping to align market interests in favor of security. That's going to require doing things that we haven't wanted to do in this space, like regulate, in part because we believe that the technology is moving too fast for government regulation to keep up. I think, though, that there is an answer here, and I think it's fairly simple. Instead of government setting requirements that we know adversaries will target to get around, our goal needs to be to require outcomes. We can do this through insurance, we can do this through other financial incentives, but we have models for this in other spaces that we can apply, so that the goal should not be to meet a list of government requirements for what security looks like, but to achieve an objective that we know current technology can meet and that the market can reinforce companies meeting that objective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kaneki. We'll now recognize Mrs. Howe to 5 minutes to summarize your statement.
Chairman Richmond, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Katko, distinguished committee members, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today about emerging cyber threats. My name is Neelu Razi Howe, and for over 2 decades, I've worked in the technology sector, including cybersecurity, as an investor, as an entrepreneur, and as an executive. When I first started working in technology, we had a utopian vision for the internet, and cybersecurity was a dark art that lived in its own silo. But as the internet has matured and every aspect of our lives has become operationalized in this domain, the threat it represents has grown in kind and in effect. From IP theft to cybercrime to espionage, hostile social manipulations, radicalization, and cyber war, the activity and malfeasance that takes place affects all of society. It affects all of our businesses, not just critical infrastructure. It affects our government's ability to provide services. And most importantly, it affects all of us, the people. The same adversary that is infiltrating our defense industrial base is stealing intellectual property from our companies, probing our infrastructure, and manipulating individuals. As Dan Geer famously said, every sociopath is now your next-door neighbor. There are no more silos. And the problem is only getting bigger as we embrace new waves of technology, innovations such as cloud computing, autonomous vehicle, small low-orbit satellites with advanced sensor platforms, the Internet of Things, drones, distributed ledger technology, augmented and virtual reality. On the horizon, we see the emergence of 5G and microsensor proliferation, autonomous weapons for private and military use, quantum computing, AI, and synthetic biology, to just name a few. People and businesses will not wait for security, laws, and regulation to catch up before they embrace these technologies. They don't have a choice. The Internet of Things, which has the potential to change industries at their core and create over $11 trillion of economic gain, has security issues that are well understood. But these issues will not slow adoption down. Oddly, there's too much at stake to wait for security. For the first time in human history, the accelerating pace of technology innovation is outstripping our ability as human beings to adapt and adjust our policies in a timeline that is relevant. Our adversaries have repeatedly shown that they can move faster than we do. They adapt and exploit technology while we grapple with its implications, emerging social norms, the uneven distribution of authorities and capabilities, and a political process that does not function at the speed of innovation. While we study the problem, our adversaries have infiltrated our systems, exploited an already polarized society, and undermined the very foundation of our democracy, the belief that there is such a thing as objective truth, because where there is no objective truth, the biggest liar wins. We need a coordinated and collaborative whole-of-society approach to rise to the challenge of these emboldened adversaries that we are out of position to deal with. It's time for the United States to set a bold cyber agenda capable of restoring trust globally. Trust in our technology, trust in our systems, trust in our infrastructure, and through that, trust in our political system, our political process, and our leaders. To be effective, our government will have to do this in partnership across the government and with private sector, and remove any barriers that prevent government agencies that have relevant information from sharing that information in the context that goes with it with the entities that are most affected. This collaboration must extend to our cities, which are overwhelmed and under-resourced. Their vulnerabilities are a homeland security issue, especially as we look at our election infrastructure and ransomware. To have trust in our systems and infrastructure, we must commit to regaining our innovation edge and never again lose our seat at the standard-setting table. as we look to the next waves of technology, especially AI and quantum. Falling behind is not about national pride, it's about national security. We must have a strong and consistent cyber deterrence policy, something only the government can deliver on. Even the strongest walls will eventually succumb to a capable and determined adversary if there is no deterrence. Technology companies that are co-conspirators with our adversaries, that facilitate communications and propaganda networks, enabling destructive and chaotic social manipulation, must be regulated. To build resilience in society to social manipulation efforts, funding and incentivizing media literacy programs that teach the difference between fact, opinion, misdirection, and lies, as well as research into deep fakes, must become a Homeland Security priority. Finally, our cybersecurity workforce lacks diversity, lagging the technology sector by a significant margin. As we build programs to skill and reskill individuals to address the massive skills shortage, we must put in place the right incentives for diversity. We need new perspectives and new mental model for how we approach this threat. Our adversaries are agile, creative, and persistent. Our technology landscape is ever shifting and our attack surface ever expanding. Preparing for the future requires a new organizational and operating model focused on persistent cooperation and collaboration at cyberspeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Howe, for your testimony. I now recognize Dr. Buchanan to summarize his opening statement for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Richmond, Chairman Thompson, and Ranking Member Katko for holding this important hearing and for inviting me to testify. My name is Ben Buchanan. I'm an assistant teaching professor at the School of Foreign Service and a senior faculty fellow at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, both at Georgetown University. I'm also a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, where I teach introductory classes on artificial intelligence and cybersecurity for congressional staff. My research specialty is examining how cybersecurity and AI shape international security. And in this vein, I co-authored recently a paper entitled Machine Learning for Policymakers. I will confine my opening remarks to the impact of AI on cybersecurity, since I think it is the emerging technology poised to have the most significant effect in this area. While there is an enormous amount of hype and debate around AI in general, the intersection of AI and cybersecurity is understudied and underappreciated. At least 3 dimensions of this problem deserve our analysis. First and most significant is the cybersecurity of AI systems themselves. AI systems are just as likely to be susceptible to the kinds of software vulnerabilities that are present in other kinds of computer code. As we have seen for decades, hackers can exploit these vulnerabilities for their own ends. There is no reason to think that hackers will not try to do the same to AI systems, and there's no reason to think that they will not at times succeed. This possibility is particularly worrying given the high stakes of some AI applications. This is not a reason to avoid using AI, but vigilance is imperative in order to improve cyber and national security. Yet to stop our analysis at just the traditional kinds of software vulnerabilities is to miss a great deal of the cybersecurity risk that AI systems pose. The neural network architecture that underpins a lot of modern AI is immensely powerful, but presents new classes of cybersecurity risk that we are only beginning to uncover and understand. We call this field adversarial learning. Using adversarial learning, hackers can cause neural networks to make bizarre errors, causing systems that rely on those networks to fail or reveal confidential information. This is a field that requires a great deal more attention. A tiny fraction of the research in AI today goes to studying AI security and the risks of adversarial learning. Our second area of analysis is that AI can chain traditional offensive cyber attacks against regular computer systems. Modern hackers in many cases do not need AI to achieve their ends. That said, I think it is noteworthy that some of the most potent cyber attacks we have seen, including last decade's Stuxnet, the 2016 blackout in Ukraine, and the 2017 attack known as NotPetya, which caused $10 billion in damage, feature some forms of automation within them. I can imagine a world in which future cyber operations will use more sophisticated automated capabilities to achieve particular tasks, such as vulnerability discovery, target selection, command and control, and attack execution. Mr. Kaneki mentioned the kill chain earlier, and it suffices to say that I think almost every aspect of the kill chain could be transformed by more powerful automated capabilities. I suspect that such automation could offer significant upsides to sophisticated hackers faced with complex targets and complex missions. In some respects, the possible upside to automation in attack is higher in the area of cyber operations than in physical warfare, since whether a plane is operated by a human or a machine, the laws of physics still apply. But it is likely that automated cyber capabilities, if sophisticated enough, could operate much faster than their human-directed counterparts. I stress, however, we have not seen this come to fruition yet. This leads to the third area of analysis, the possibility that AI might help on cyber defense. This idea is also the subject of a lot of hype and a lot of investment. There seems to be discrete ways in which AI can indeed help secure computer systems, both in discovering vulnerabilities before hackers do, and also in detecting the presence of malicious code. However, we must be careful not to let the hype outrun the reality on this front. In evaluating cybersecurity advances in this area, we should compare them to the baseline of technologies we already use, many of which already involve automation, and understand how, if at all, automation and our modern paradigm of machine learning actually improves our defenses. I do believe that AI-enabled tools are likely to be a fundamental part of modern and future cyber offense and defense. The scale, size, and speed of cyber operations will make this inevitable, and it is imperative that we keep up with changing times. That said, we must not forget that cyber operations, no matter how sophisticated, are still fundamentally human operations. For as much as we will talk about technology today, we must remember that the people in our organizations, including in government, are key to addressing these threats. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes to ask questions. Let me just start with some of the things that you all talked about. Mr. Kaneki, you mentioned that there are examples where governments set the objectives or goals. Can you give me some of those in your train of thought on how government should do it or what the goals should be?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The analogy that I like to use in this space is how we handle oil spills. We all remember the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989. In 1990, Congress passed bipartisan legislation, the Oil Pollution Act. And what that act said was if you're going to bring oil into U.S. waters, you need to have insurance that would cover the full cost of cleaning up a loss of containment from that vessel. And so the important thing that that act did is it didn't say, here are the requirements for safety of your vessels, here's what you must do. It said, you will own the cost, the polluter will pay. Well, I think we can adapt that model very easily to areas like data spills. Treat data spills like oil spills. If you want to hold 140 million records of US citizen data, then you probably should have to have an insurance bond that would pay out on the order of, back of the envelope math would suggest, about $1,000 per record. That would require the insurance industry to be able to measure risk in a way that they cannot measure today, and to measure security in a way they cannot measure today. But I'm quite confident that from that point on, markets would be able to adopt new strategies to be able to price that risk and enforce it so they wouldn't have to pay out that kind of insurance payment.
And part of my thinking, and you mentioned Atlanta in your testimony and other places, part of my concern, and I'll pick a fictional place so that I don't offend any community, but let's think of Mayberry, North Carolina, where Barney Fife was the sheriff's deputy. It's made up. So how do we ensure that they're up with the times in terms of protecting their data and their cyber hygiene and all of those things? How do we get them to where they need to be?
This is a very unpopular opinion, Mr. Chairman. The first thing I would do is I would ban ransomware payments. What we are doing at this point is handing hundreds of millions of dollars over to our adversaries. They're taking that money, they're spending some of it on Lamborghinis and leather jackets. The rest of the money they are reinvesting to up their capabilities. They're growing more sophisticated, they're building larger teams. They started out doing ransomware against individuals. They're now doing hospital systems and local governments. It's only a matter of time before they do the power grid. So from that perspective, we've got to stop funding them.
I'm gonna stop asking you questions. Ms. Howe, you mentioned autonomous weapons. What's out there when you speak of that?
Today, the technology exists to have completely autonomous weapons. They're available both for the military and also for private use, where you can set up sniper rifles to take down targets from great distances with very little human intervention. That exists out there, and when they're networked, it creates a interesting dilemma from a security perspective.
Thank you. Mr. Durbin, you mentioned stalker apps or stalkerware. Tell me how it will get on a member's phone or one of the panelists' phone.
Well, stalkerware is considered malicious software, and like most threats and malicious software packages, there's no difference in how they would end up on a device. So like a phishing exercise where you get an email and you're asked to click on a link that could execute a program to load it in, or even you could do it via text. Since stalkerware sometimes involves somebody that the stalker knows, if they have physical access to the phone, then they would be able to obviously grab it and load it on. So it's like typical threats. You can be tricked into having the software load.
Okay. And I would imagine that you all sell software to detect it?
Yes, we do.
Okay. With that, I'll recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Katko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Howe, during your testimony, well, all of you talked about the various threats that are out there, and I really, truly believe they're constantly playing catch-up, and that's a concern. But, Ms. Howe, you mentioned that we being the government, need to set a bold cyber agenda. Could you just drill down a little bit more into what you envision would be good for us to do?
Well, certainly, sir, and thank you for the question. From the outset, I think there are things only the government can do that would have a tremendous impact on the threat landscape. Having a consistent cyber deterrence policy that imposes cost on the adversary is a great starting point. It's unfair to expect companies to be able to defend themselves against nation-state adversaries who are committed, and we've done that in the past. We certainly wouldn't do that in the kinetic world, but we are doing that in the cyber world, where we expect companies to defend themselves. We also have to, some of the authorities that were written for defending our most critical systems were written before there was a commercial internet. As we take a holistic look and see what's happening in the dynamics of the market, we have to be willing to re-examine how we operate as a government, the authorities and capabilities mismatch that we all talk about, and how we organize and how we collaborate at cyber speed.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Buchanan, you talked about the human element factor, and one common theme that I believe in is that with the emerging technologies and the threats the way they are, the human element remains critical to the functionality of the attacks. So how do we make the human element attacks less of a factor with emerging technologies, or can we?
Well, I think, again, as much as we talk about technology, it's important to recognize that both on offense and defense, there are humans involved. And one of the things I worry about quite a bit as someone who teaches students who often go into government is the capacity to educate future policymakers and policy advisors, to have government hiring authorities to bring people into government so they can serve in this mission set on offense and on defense. For reasons you can imagine relating to compensation and other factors, oftentimes many of these individuals go to the private sector and don't end up in government working on these important missions.
Thank you. And it's a question for everyone here. Mr. Durbin, we can start with you. And it's about quantum computing. In my hometown, Syracuse, New York, they have a robust quantum computing research operation underway, but it's, of course, not the only one in the country. And I'm vitally concerned about quantum computing in that when one of you said that if China gets it, basically, we're in big trouble. And it should be something that we prioritize better than we are right now. And I'm just wondering, should we, it's a softball question, but I want to hear what your answers are. Should we be making more of a concerted effort to develop our quantum capabilities on the government level, given how much of an advantage fully functional quantum computing can provide?
Yes, it's a serious threat. It is coming. The time frames are very debatable, but the time to come up with defenses are now, not when somebody does have the first functional working quantum computer. The algorithms that are using or the encryption algorithms for protecting data right now will not be sufficient with quantum. So we need to come up with the new problem that's hard for a quantum computer to solve. I'm encouraged with the attention that NIST has been giving this topic, and so I encourage them to keep going with the research that they're doing. But yes, it is coming, and focus needs to be brought to bear.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's a bit, it's a bit diffuse, the projects, and there's not like a centralization, if you will, of the overall goal. I mean, I view this as a modern day moonshot, because if the Chinese get it before us, really our encryption our encryption capabilities are going to be severely hampered, and we're already vulnerable as it is. So, as you say, Kaneki, is that how you say it, or Nake? Yeah. What can we do as a government from a prioritization standpoint? To me, it seems to me that we need to do more to make this a high priority within government. It's not something that people can see and feel, like the moonshot, if you will, but it is something that is critically important to us going forward. And how do we get the government to prioritize this more?
So I think the way that I would approach this problem is to say that we need to focus on it with the same energy and really the same level of resources as we would maybe a Manhattan Project or a moonshot, but we need to harness the capabilities within our private sector. So instead of having one large Manhattan project out in the Southwest desert, in this case, we need to have dozens, if not hundreds of companies working on various aspects of it. There are models for how we've done this in the past. I would call SpaceX as a good example of a commercial supported endeavor. But I think the key here is more research going to more teams to compete globally and hope that one of those teams that is going to win is going to be a US-based team. I think we can't really put all our eggs either in the hope that Silicon Valley is going to solve this problem for us, or that a government research team, singly funded and focused, is going to beat the Chinese, who I view as the major adversary in this space.
Thank you all. I wish I had more time to ask you a ton of questions, but I'm out of time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chairman of the full committee, Mr. Thompson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Richmond. As I heard the witnesses' testimony today, I became very suspect of something I can't do without. But the challenge for this committee and members of Congress is how do we not overreact to a problem so that government all of a sudden is stifling innovation and a lot of other things with regulation. So, and one of the reasons hearings like this are held is to try to get the benefit of the talent that's out here, especially in the private sector. Some of us believe that there is a role for government, but it's to encourage the development of the technologies and things that we need, while understanding that it's really the private sector and its talents that ultimately will get us to where we need to be. So, but a couple of things I heard. One is right now we're kind of reacting to the problem rather than getting ahead of it. And can you suggest a way forward for us to wait until the next attack occurs in anticipation of whatever that is that we could do as members of Congress to get us to that point? Mr. Durbin, if you can get us started with some idea.
It's tempting to react to the buzzword, what people are talking about in the press, like the deep fakes. I encourage that we also have to keep our eye on the threats that have been plaguing us for a long time. Email, for example, still tends to be the #1 threat vector out there that attackers use to do their malicious things. As soon as a bad guy figures out a way to utilize email, then companies like ourselves, we counter it, then they come up with a new clever way. We can always be prepared for what's coming by focusing on what's tried and true and what we know that the adversaries aren't going to back away from. Ransomware. Today I talked about targeted ransomware. This is the first time since we've been tracking it where the shift has moved to the enterprise versus the individual. And why are they doing that? They're doing that because when you target somebody and you really understand their network, you can get in there deep, compromise as many assets as possible, launch it at the same time, and it puts pressure on that company. We better pay the ransom because we're tied up. Solving ransomware will help you to solve the next iteration, the next usage of it, and it's a way to kind of stay ahead of the curve.
Mr. Kaneki.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would focus on 3 brief ideas. One, I think we need to have a much higher degree of disclosure of cyber incidents. We really don't have a clear picture of how badly we are owned by Chinese or Russian or other adversaries. Companies tend to try and avoid disclosing publicly what has happened. So on the one hand, we have the number that General Alexander has put out, which I believe to be accurate, of possibly as high as $400 billion in loss from economic espionage by the Chinese. But we have very few cases where we actually know of public incidents where that loss has happened. That puts investors at a disadvantage, it puts stakeholders at a disadvantage, and it keeps markets from inflicting pain on companies that don't have good security. With that, I would highly recommend the idea of creating one or more National Transportation Safety Board-like mechanisms to dig in and understand why these incidents happen once they are disclosed, so those lessons learned can get pushed out to the broader ecosystem. Finally, I think this is all about creating collaboration, defensive collaboration with government and with the private sector. Today, we don't have the system that we need to be able to do that, to trust the end users and to trust the systems over which information is shared. So that's why I've advocated for extending classified connectivity out to critical infrastructure companies beyond the defense industrial base. I think that's essential.
Thank you. Ms. Howe.
Chairman Thompson, you're exactly right that the attack surface is ever shifting, the landscape moves on us, and the most important thing we can do is put in place a collaborative process that can be as agile as the threat landscape and as our adversaries are. We've had great examples of this. The Russia Small Group, which had a very specific goal of protecting the 2018 midterm elections, did their job. They did it. It was Cyber Command, NSA, FBI, DHS working together with private sector. The Enduring Security Framework is another example of this collaboration working. If we could systematize that kind of collaboration so that no matter how our adversary adapts, no matter how our technology evolves, we can be as agile as they are. I don't think we can predict with precision how these attacks will take place in the future, but if we organize the right way, we can make a difference. The other thing I would put out there is today we want to have resilience and protect ourselves. The boldest thing we can do is to decide to defeat the adversary in cyberspace and to organize to actually defeat the adversary. That's something we're absolutely capable of doing. It takes a lot of resolve to do. But again, working society, government hand in hand with trust between the two, we can accomplish that.
Dr. Buchanan.
Just in terms of concrete ideas, I think we need to do a lot more study of the cybersecurity vulnerabilities of emerging systems, ideally before we employ them. This is something we, in many cases, did not do with old cyber systems. The good news, I think, is that the government does have some capacity to do this that we could use as a foundation. I'm thinking in particular of NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which has a very small effort, but a promising one to study weaknesses in artificial intelligence systems. It seems to me that'd be something that's ripe for expansion, where we could study the problems that many in the private sector, because of market interest, are not studying, but that will be quite impactful for broader society if they were to be targeted by adversaries.
Thank you very much. I asked the chair, I have some follow-up questions we'll submit to the witnesses in writing along this line, but I thank you very much.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Buchanan, I'd like to stay with you if I could, please. In August, President Trump announced a rule restricting government agencies from doing business with the Chinese telecommunications company Huawei due to national security threats. What was our exposure to Huawei when the decision was reached?
Congressman, I don't know that I'm in a position to judge the U.S. government's exposure or United States' exposure to Huawei. I'd imagine that what would concern me most would be exposure in classified networks, and I'm in no position to have visibility into that.
So you don't necessarily have anything that's confirmed, but you do have some concerns. Is that fair to say without having to get into detail?
Sure, I think it's fair to say that telecommunication systems provide enormous access to the information and broader networks of which they're a part. And in general, I worry about that as a significant threat. And
yes, not everybody on the panel, technology still is an issue for, I'm realizing, but that's a different story. So what has changed in the trends of agencies' contract acquisition since the ban, such as the type of contract signed or how contractors are chosen?
Again, I'm not sure I have visibility into the contracting processes.
Okay, all right, so maybe my final question for you then may be the same thing. Are there alternatives to the covered banned telecom companies such as Huawei routers and other companies' data networks, or have agencies been struggling to fulfill their task because of the ban? Can you address that?
Yeah, speaking generally, there are other players in the telecommunications market. I think it's a smaller market than we would like. Huawei has a price advantage, which is why they're attractive, but they're not the only supplier in the world.
Okay, do you see any of that changing in the foreseeable future as far as these smaller companies having a little bit more access or a little bit more stronger foothold?
I think it's fair to say that I worry generally about competition in the space because there's not that many players. So
Okay.
yeah, in general, I think there's reason why we'd want more competition than we have right now. And in particular, we might want more U.S. companies involved than is currently the case.
Okay, thanks, I appreciate you going there. I believe it's Kaneki, is that correct? In your testimony, you mentioned that in a race, and this struck me a little bit, in a race between Silicon Valley and China, I believe you said Silicon Valley would lose in respect to these emerging technologies. Is that correct? I'm going to come back with a question just to make sure I heard that correct, right? Is that fair?
Yes, I think
All right.
that's fair.
There is no question that Huawei is circumventing the U.S. export ban and experiencing success in becoming self-sufficient. So my question is this. If China becomes totally self-reliant in these technologies, such as the production of their own advanced chips, what impact do you think that is going to have on the U.S. economy 5, 10, 50 years down the road?
So I'm in a minority within the international relations community on this topic, but what I think is going to happen is we're largely going to see a split of the internet into 1, 2, or 3 parts, and with it a split of the underlying technologies, so that we're unlikely to see a situation, barring massive political change in China, in which U.S. companies are able to compete there for that market. Therefore, I don't think we're going to continue to allow China to compete in our market. So I think we're going to have very different technology development and very different paths.
Well, you answered the second question as far as if they have the largest R&D funding in the sector, how would we expect companies in the U.S. to compete with the Chinese government-backed company from dominating the telecom market? And you just answered that. Looked like it's going to be 2 independent sectors here.
Yeah, sir, I would say that I think that it's almost a dirty word within policy communities in Washington, but it is time that we relook at the concept of industrial policy. How are we going to assure that 6G, however we decide to define that, is something that the United States can compete in and isn't going to fall behind these other actors? Choices were made by leading telecommunications firms in the United States not to compete in this space. That clearly was not in our national security interest. So we've got to find ways to make sure they choose to compete in the next generation.
A lot of my questions, a lot of the focus in the media and national security is on Huawei, but there are other companies that should cause major concern as well for the U.S. national security. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Especially in the emerging technologies. in my closing few seconds, what should be done, in your opinion, to prevent these companies from posing a security risk specifically, obviously, in our country?
So I think one of the things that we need to look at, which is again a very unpopular opinion, is can we maintain global supply chains? Or do we need to have trusted supply chains by trusted companies that are either manufactured in the United States or by our allies? Can we trust chips and devices and components that are manufactured abroad for critical systems?
Thank you for your testimony. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from North Carolina yields back. The gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Is that better? Okay, there we go. I just want to thank our panel of witnesses for your testimony today and your contributions to raising our national security awareness and providing steps forward to how we better protect the country in cyber. Mr. Kaneki, first of all, I'm not going to get into this question, but on the issue of being able to discuss industrial policy, I couldn't agree with you more. We need to make sure that we can do that and take the politics out of it and really focus on the issue at hand. And so I agree on that point. So this is a question, and actually one other point I want to make is how I completely would agree with you on what you talked about in terms of critical thinking and this issue of our adversaries using our values and our commitment to free speech and using these social media platforms as weapons against us and undermining our democracy is something that I've worried about for a long time. Being able to think critically when you talk about media and issues that are raised. If the public can't do that, we're already losing, and we need to build that resilience into our democracy, and it starts with our kids and teaching civics in class and also doing things like critical thinking. But this question is for all witnesses, and I'd like to start with Mr. Kaneki. In your collective testimony, you all focus on significant attention on new tactics and techniques to achieve malign cyber goals. You do not, though, to a large extent, focus on threat actors. So do you believe that cyber threat actor environment is likely to remain largely static in the coming years with major challenges coming from China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, and lesser problems from organized crime and other non-state actors, or are we likely to see major shifts?
Thank you, Congressman. I would say that I think from a nation-state perspective, the threats are largely determined by the geopolitics and the ability for any nation-state to rapidly acquire offensive cyber capability means that any of our adversaries are likely to confront us in cyberspace if they deem it in their interests. You touched on organized crime. I think we're at the point where organized crime in cyberspace really represents a danger and a national security danger, a national security threat. The capabilities are only growing. Their interests in generating financial revenue are moving them out of purely the cyber realm and into the physical realm. So we have hybrid threats emerging from these criminal groups. They're operating out of safe havens. I think that they are, like the drug cartels in the 1990s, very much a national security threat as certain nation states.
How about in terms of mitigating our risk, and how much would you focus on responding to threat actors, vice technological steps that we can take to protect ourselves from emerging threats?
What I've advocated is that there's a limited amount we can do to threat actors. I certainly agree with Ms. Howe that we want to engage them everywhere we can and in every way that we can, but really our national strategy needs to be about building resilience. We need to be able to have most attacks bounce off of our infrastructure, and we need to be able to bounce back rapidly should those protections fail. That kind of strategy, I think, is really in our national interest, and that's where we want to focus on incentives and aligning technology around those incentives.
Thank you. Mr. Durbin, in your written testimony, you make reference to something that we've been focusing a great deal on right now, and that's risk posed to ever-expanding supply chains and the various accesses they provide to networks. Can you expand upon the growth that you've seen in this type of threat? And to our other witnesses, do you believe that intrusions through supply chain will continue to rise in the future? And given that malicious actors often use software update mechanisms when attacking through supply chain, are you concerned that an uptick in supply chain attacks could actually undermine faith in this important hygiene measure?
So the supply chain is attractive because if your main target has a sufficient enough cybersecurity budget and has done the due diligence to protect themselves, instead of spending your resources trying to penetrate them, let's go down the supply chain and look for someone who is less diligent, attack there, and try to feed the attack back upstream into the main target. So that is always going to be an attractive vector that we're going to have to stay diligent with. I think using the supply chain and compromising software download sites and software patching sites is also going to be very attractive because you're able to reach a large number of people, and you're doing it in a way where the victim thinks that they're interacting with a trusted site. So you're not going to be as cognizant, or you're not going to be as concerned or suspicious. So it can be a very powerful threat vector.
Thank you. I know my time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman from Rhode Island yields back. Gentleman, Mr. Taylor is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this hearing. In 2017, I carried the cybersecurity package for the state of Texas, or Texas legislature. In that package, the Attorney General of Texas asked for a limited defensive prosecution in the event that he wanted to take down a human trafficking website. So he would take down a human trafficking gang. The website with the victim's pictures would still be left on the internet, and he wanted the ability to conduct a denial of service attack against that site to take it down and to eliminate that site on the internet. So that takes me to my line of questioning, which is around offensive operations against cyber predators, right? So we've got people out there that are conducting cyber attacks in the United States, whether it's denial of service, whether it's ransomware, et cetera. This is thorny legal ground, but I was just wondering, since we have some really smart people in the room, what are your thoughts on conducting offensive operations against those that are actually conducting attacks on us? I mean, retaliating, in effect, doing a ransomware attack on people that are doing ransomware attacks on us. And I'll let you go in order. Mr. Durbin, do you want to?
So there are a few issues. First is attribution. The attacker can hide who they really are. So it may appear as if they're coming from a hospital overseas, and that you're going to go attack this hospital that was innocent. If you do identify the correct attacker and you attack them, you risk escalation because they may come back at us again. But I think one thing that we often overlook, traditional warfare, if you throw a hand grenade at somebody, it blows up. They can't pick it up and throw it back at you. If we launch an attack, we're basically giving them that software that they can re-engineer and use against us or use against others. I think there's a way to use a deterrence, maybe the threat of it, or to demonstrate what we could do. But I think hack attacks or attackbacks are delicate.
Mr. Schnack?
Thank you, Congressman. I would say that I'm all in favor of Cyber Command taking a more active role in defense of private industry and state and local government. I think that the idea of other entities than Cyber Command carrying out that offensive operation is scary and could put us into situations that we don't want to be in. But I do think if we had the kind of capability where, for instance, a critical infrastructure company that was involved in a threat from an overseas actor was able to communicate that in real time with high assurance, with trust among the parties over a classified network, that then Cyber Command could essentially be tipped off to that activity and target to shut it down. So we really just need tighter collaboration rather than kind of a go-it-alone approach by private companies. And I think that's possible.
Well, and while I've got you, just one quick thing. You said you want to see greater clarity in cyber attacks. The problem that we've grappled with on this subcommittee is that if we tell people where the attacks are or what the effective attack, we're basically saying, hey, there's a vulnerability here. So I mean, I appreciate the desire for transparency. I'm for that. But in this particular instance, if I give you transparency, I'm basically telling you where you can attack me. Do you want to just quickly respond on that? And I'll go back to the offensive question here with Ms. Howe.
Yeah, I think there's two pieces to it. I think one, the adversary's already exploited the vulnerability if they've created the incident, and so from that point of view, you're not going to be sharing information, assuming that you've patched that specific vulnerability and built protections around that specific threat. So I think that can be addressed. I also think that if we can build the kind of collaborative defense that we've been talking about and the trust between partners, you don't necessarily need to share that information publicly or with the world. That disclosure could be made with partner private sector companies and agencies.
Ms. Howe, going back to the offensive question.
I often tell my children I have escalation dominance, so they should never take me on. And I think when it comes to offensive cyber operations, you have to make sure you have escalation dominance, which means it's only the purview of the U.S. government to conduct offensive cyber activity. And I agree with Mr. Kaneki that we've seen Cyber Command do that effectively. We need to have a very consistent policy of engagement if we're going to engage in offensive cyber. If we do, it essentially becomes part of the cyber deterrence policy. When it comes to attribution, I would say our government is the best in the world at attribution. We haven't gotten it wrong, and in fact, even last week, the NSA put out an advisory showing that the Russians were using Iranian tools and infrastructure and hiding as Iranians when they were conducting their attacks. So this is one place where the U.S. government is fantastic, knows what it's doing, and we've got the capabilities to launch offensive cyber the right way. We have to have the policies, and we need to be able to communicate them. I do not think this is something the private sector should do.
All right, I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas has yielded. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Underwood.
Thank you, Chairman Richmond. Last week, members of this committee traveled to my district, Illinois 14th District, to hold a hearing examining what steps the state of Illinois has taken in coordination with the federal government to prepare for the 2020 election. In Illinois, foreign adversaries were able to exploit a vulnerability in our state's voter database to access the records of 76,000 Illinoisans. And since then, Illinois has used federal and state dollars to increase its cybersecurity posture by executing the Cyber Navigator program. This model continues to be a valuable tool for election officials around the state who now have access to a sure intranet system and a highly trained cybersecurity personnel. We know that social media is an important source of information in communities like mine. A majority of Americans check social media at least once daily. So, Mr. Durbin, what advice can you offer to social media users about how to recognize the difference between a post from our neighbor and a post from a bot campaign?
That's a challenging ask. The people that are coming up with these posts that are trying to deceive you, they're very good at them. So. I think the platforms themselves are going to have to be involved in looking at the metadata of where these posts are coming from to help identify, is this really a person or is this a bot? But if it's not from somebody that you don't know or that you're just hearing from, and it's on something that's topical, that could be, or topical to the election, that would be a flag for me.
And what we often see is that, people are in groups. And that they're not friends with the people in the group, so it just pops up on their feed. So if I'm a mom in the 14th, what should I be looking for, right? Because I don't have access to that metadata.
Again, I think if it's from someone that you don't know, and it seems awfully topical. It's a pretty good coincidence that around this election, this is a hot topic for us, I'm getting a social post from somebody I don't know. That would be certainly a red flag for me.
Okay, and if they, being the social media users, want to report a potential bot campaign, do social media companies currently have a timely and effective way for people to do that?
I don't know for sure that what processes the social media companies have in place.
Anybody else? Can anybody else answer that?
I'll speak from personal experience. The only way I was able to report a fake LinkedIn profile that had connected with me was to tweet at LinkedIn. That was the only way they responded. They did not respond to the abuse report I filed.
Interesting. Following the 2016 election, Symantec conducted extensive research on the use of Twitter bot campaigns to promote disinformation leading up to and during the 2016 election. Mr. Durbin, can you share any lessons or key findings from that research as we prepare for the 2020 election?
It was very well planned. There's this impression that it was a bunch of trolls out there that were behind this. We found that not to be the case. They took their time in planning. They set accounts up months before they started using them. They were set up so that it was kind of a main group that was responsible for the key content. And then there was a much larger group of the bots that were designed to get that fake messaging out. And it was very effective with this kind of generate and amplify. The response to one of the accounts, which was in my testimony, only 10,000 tweets, but was retweeted over 6 million times. That's a clear indicator that those 6 million were not bots. Those were actual people that were choosing to read a message that was generated from a fake account,
Right.
believe it, and then retweet it out to other people.
Right. For years now, social media companies have been on record saying that they're working to combat the use of their platforms to spread disinformation, specifically during election times. But new reports emerge every day. Just yesterday, we heard about 4 new disinformation campaigns backed by foreign states on Facebook. Do you believe that these companies are prepared today for the 2020 elections? Mr. Durbin.
They claim that they are, and I believe that they have the tools and the resources inside that they could take action. Whether or not they are, I'm not an expert. I'm not inside those organizations.
Okay, thank you. We've done a lot to secure our elections, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done to secure our nation's election infrastructure. As technology continues to advance, so must our resources and policies to combat foreign adversaries who would seek to exploit new technologies to do us harm. Moving forward, this is going to take a whole of government approach to preserve the integrity of our democratic institutions. I look forward to working with all my colleagues on this committee in the House to address election security from all angles, and I yield back.
The gentlelady from Illinois, yield back. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objection, the committee record shall be kept open for 10 days. Hearing no further business, the committee stands adjourned.